Welcome to the Uncanny Valley podcast. Today, we're not just opening a book, we're kind of stepping onto an intellectual earthquake zone, really. Our focus is this, profound and pretty formidable text, selected excerpts from Friedrich Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil. And look, this isn't just about reading some philosopher, it's really about challenging the absolute bedrock of our most cherished ideas. We're going to try and dissect what we normally consider truth, what we think is good, and even something as fundamental as free will. Now, Nietzsche, as you probably know, he has this legendary reputation for being provocative, right? He's a master at shaking up comfortable assumptions. So our goal for you, our listeners, is to sort of embark on this guided journey through some pretty challenging material. We want to pull out those surprising insights, those real aha moments from what can often feel like incredibly dense philosophy. This is really our way into understanding his, let's call it, radical reevaluation of values. We'll touch on philosophy, psychology, culture, religion, the very essence of humanity. It's a deep exploration, and we hope it makes these profound ideas feel really relevant to how you see the world.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. That's our mission for this particular exploration, to try and uncover what Nietzsche quite boldly identifies as the prejudices of philosophers, and also to trace what he, again, provocatively calls the natural history of morals. So right from the start, we need to set the expectation, that this discussion will challenge a lot of your deeply ingrained assumptions, ideas you might not have even consciously thought about what's really good or what's actually true. Yeah. It's about pushing us and pushing you to look beyond good and evil. Not in a nihilistic sense, maybe, but beyond those traditional unexamined values we often just inherit. Now, some of these ideas, they might feel uncomfortable, yeah, even jarring at first. But the intellectual reward, I think, of going on this kind of venture, of really critically looking at where our most fundamental beliefs come from and seeing the world through such a radical lens, is genuinely immense. It's really an invitation to think differently and maybe more deeply about pretty much everything you thought you knew.
Okay, so let's peel back those layers right from the very beginning. Nietzsche kicks off Beyond Good and Evil with this really audacious, almost playful question. It feels like a jab at philosophy itself, doesn't it? He says. Supposing that truth is a woman, what then?
Right. And he immediately suggests that, all philosophers, especially the dogmatists, they might have completely failed to understand truth precisely because they've misunderstood women. He compares their usual pursuit of truth to this kind of terrible seriousness and clumsy importunity.
Like they're just unskilled and, frankly, unseemly methods for winning over a woman.
Exactly. And it's not just some colorful metaphor,
Yeah.
It's his way of questioning the very purity of the will to truth itself, that supposedly objective, spotless driving force behind all philosophy.
So he's asking, is this desire for truth really pure? Is it unbiased? Or does it hide some strange, perplexing, questionable questions underneath that earnest surface?
Yeah, he's hinting that the very drive to find truth might be, let's say, contaminated by the seeker's own approach, their hidden prejudices, maybe even their unconscious drives.
And he pushes this further, doesn't he? Arguing that dogmatic philosophy, these grand systems like, say, the ancient Vedanta in Asia or Platonism in Europe, have actually been enormous and awe-inspiring caricatures.
Caricatures. Think about that word. It implies distortion, exaggeration.
Right. He sees these huge intellectual structures, kind of like astrology in earlier times, which he points out actually demanded more effort, more gold, more intellectual sharpness than any real science, as necessary stages maybe, but ultimately stages that humanity has to surpass.
They weren't eternal truths, but perhaps useful fictions needed to organize human thought at specific historical moments.
He's incredibly critical of Plato, for example. He calls Plato's invention of the pure spirit and the good in itself just the worst, the most tiresome, and the most dangerous of errors hitherto. Ouch.
It's harsh. Nietzsche sounds almost like a doctor diagnosing a cultural illness. He even asks, how did such a malady attack that finest product of antiquity, Plato? Had the wicked Socrates really corrupted him? Was Socrates, after all, a corrupter of youths and deserved his hemlock?
That's a scandalous question, right? Suggesting even the revered Socrates might have been a corrupting influence on the very idea of objective truth. So, for you, the listener, it really begs the question, can we actually trust the famous truthfulness of philosophers? What hidden impulses might really be driving their search for knowledge if it's not just a pure, simple desire for truth?
Exactly. That skepticism is precisely what leads him to start dismantling another really fundamental assumption. He calls it the belief in antitheses of values. This is a core metaphysical prejudice he thinks underpins, well, basically all of Western thought.
He means those obvious oppositions we live by, right? Like good versus evil, true versus false, conscious versus instinct.
Yeah, those binaries. We instinctively think they're separate, opposing forces. But then he drops this radical perhaps into the conversation. He suggests, and this is quite something, it might even be possible that what constitutes the value of those good and respected things consists precisely in their being insidiously related, knotted, and crocheted to these evil and apparently opposed things, perhaps even in being essentially identical with them.
Wow. Okay, that's a profoundly uncomfortable thought. It just blurs the lines we rely on to define everything, our world, our morality.
It really does. What if good isn't the opposite of evil at all, but just maybe a different expression of the same underlying forces? And he pushes this even further. He asserts that the falseness of an opinion is not for us any objection to it.
Now, that's where he really flips conventional thinking on its head.
Absolutely. For Nietzsche, the crucial question isn't whether an opinion is objectively true or false. Instead, the question is how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving. Is it useful for life?
So, pragmatic usefulness over objective truth.
Pretty much. He even claims that the falsest opinions, including what someone like Kant called synthetic judgments a priori, those supposedly universal truths we figure out just through reason, are actually the most indispensable to us.
Okay, unpack that a bit. How can the falsest opinions be indispensable?
Well, think about it. Our belief in a consistent self, right, or an absolute right and wrong, or even just simplifying reality into categories like trees or chairs. These might be what he calls logical fictions, ways we simplify a really chaotic world, but they are absolutely vital for us to function as human beings.
So, simplifications that let us live.
Exactly. He states quite starkly, to recognize untruth as a condition of life. That's precisely what places a philosophy beyond good and evil. This radical insight suggests our very survival, our ability to thrive, might depend on certain useful fictions, certain necessary untruths that give us coherence and drive. It's a pretty brutal take on reality, isn't it?
It really is. And this pragmatic view, it extends right into our own minds, doesn't it?
It does. He connects this to a deep distrust of what we consider immediate certainties. Things like, I think or I will. Nietzsche famously calls these a contradictio in adjecto, a contradiction in terms.
Why a contradiction?
Because he argues that even the grammatical subject I isn't a certainty. It's an interpretation of a really complex flowing process. Imagine a thought just popping into your head uninvited. He says, a thought comes when it wishes and not when I wish.
So I don't control my thoughts completely.
That's the challenge. It questions the whole idea of a single autonomous self that's the sole deliberate cause of his thoughts and actions. It suggests the I is more like a convenient label, maybe a shorthand, for a whole bunch of underlying impulses and processes we don't fully grasp.
Okay, so if truth can be dangerous and untruth, maybe even deliberate falsification, can be necessary for life, how does this profoundly change your approach as a listener to knowledge and belief? And maybe even more unsettling, how does it change your very sense of self, that seemingly solid I that's experiencing the world?
That is a truly unsettling question, isn't it? This idea that our foundation might be built on these necessary fictions.
Yeah, and this line of thinking leads us right into one of humanity's most treasured concepts, free will. Nietzsche challenges this directly. He calls it a popular prejudice and something way more complicated than we usually think.
He sees it as a kind of unity only in name, and that name itself has hidden this popular prejudice that's misled philosophers for ages.
So how does he unpack it? He says willing isn't just one simple act, right?
Not at all. It's a surprisingly complex process. He describes it as a complex of sensation and thinking, but, and this is crucial, above all, an emotion. And in fact, the emotion of the command.
That feeling of consciously directing something.
Exactly. That feeling of exertion, of telling something, do this.
And here's where it gets really insightful, I think. He explains this fascinating duality inside us when we will something.
Yeah, he says, we are at the same time the commanding and the obeying parties.
Okay, explain that.
Well, think about it. You feel that sensation of commanding within yourself, that push to act. But then at the same time as the obeying party, you also feel the sensations of constraint, impulsion, pressure, resistance, and motion that come after.
Like a little internal drama, command and response.
Sort of. And he argues that the common belief that just willing is enough for action, that simply deciding makes it happen, leads to erroneous conclusions. We wrongly attribute the success of an action just to the will itself. We enjoy this increase of the sensation of power, feeling like it's a direct result of our pure will when it's actually much more complex.
So our sense of control is maybe more layered, more perhaps illusory than we like to think?
Precisely. And this brings us to that phrase Nietzsche uses, causa issui, literally, cause of oneself.
Which he calls the best self-contradiction. Why?
Well, imagine trying to lift yourself up by pulling on your own hair. It's impossible, right? An impossible act of self-creation.
Yeah, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps out of nothing.
Exactly. And Nietzsche says our deep craving for freedom of will in that absolute metaphysical sense, this desire to be solely responsible for everything we do, without any influence from God or genes or society or even just chance, is exactly that kind of impossible self-creation. It's an extravagant pride of man, he says, wishing to pull oneself up into existence by the hair out of the slough of nothingness.
So he distinguishes between strong and weak wills.
He does. And he argues that the concept of non-free will is often just a mythology, not really a philosophical truth, but maybe a convenient story used by the weak will to dodge responsibility or blame.
Ah, a way to mask their own shortcomings, like presenting it as a religion of human suffering, where blame always lies elsewhere.
Right. So for you, the listener, does thinking about your will not as simple absolute freedom, but as this internal command and obedience thing, this complex play of inner forces, does that change how you perceive your own choices, your actions, and ultimately your responsibilities?
That's a really interesting reframing. And building on that internal dynamic, his ideas about willing and maybe self-deception lead to this really controversial, but I think deeply insightful claim about philosophy itself.
Yeah, he asserts that every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely, the confession of its originator and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography.
Meaning what seems like an objective system of thought is actually a deeply personal story, a window into the philosopher's own soul and struggles.
That's the idea. He argues that the moral or immoral purpose is the true vital germ of any philosophy, not some pure detached impulse to knowledge. In other words, a philosopher's worldview isn't just born from cold logic. It springs from their deepest impulses, their values, even their personal biases, anxieties, desires.
So who the philosopher is, their character, their temperament, their gut feelings ultimately shapes their whole system, consciously or not.
Yes, particularly in the moral stance their philosophy takes.
Does he give examples?
He does, and they're quite striking. Spinoza's philosophy, for instance, that system built on logical deductions, very detached view of God and nature. Nietzsche sees it as a masquerade of a sickly recluse, maybe betraying personal timidity and vulnerability.
So the complex logic could be a kind of defense mechanism, a way for a solitary person to impose order on chaos from a place of personal weakness.
That's Nietzsche's reading, yeah. He even wonders if Epicurus's famous irritation with Plato's grandiose manner wasn't just intellectual disagreement, but maybe stemmed from rage and ambitious envy.
So hinting at really personal human motives behind these seemingly objective intellectual battles.
Exactly, and suggests the philosopher isn't some detached brain in a vat. They're very human beings. Their experiences, desires, instincts, they profoundly shape their entire intellectual output.
Okay, so for you, the listener, if every philosophy is basically an unwitting autobiography, a personal confession in disguise, how might that change how you read philosophical texts? Does it mean that to really get a philosophy, you have to understand the philosopher first, with all their human quirks and motivations?
That's a huge implication, isn't it? It forces us to question the source of knowledge itself.
Yeah, and it's this skepticism that leads us right to Nietzsche's really fundamental concept, the one he thinks underlies all human striving, what he calls psychology as the morphology and development doctrine of the will to power.
Right. He argues that psychology, as it was back then, had basically run aground on moral prejudices and timidities. It was afraid to really launch out into the depths of human motivation.
Because these moral biases had penetrated deeply, even into supposedly unbiased intellectual worlds, acting in an injurious, obstructive, blinding, and distorting manner.
Exactly. They stopped us from seeing the raw drives underneath our actions.
Okay, so what does this actually mean for us?
Well, it means embracing a profoundly radical idea that emotions we usually see as negative, things like hatred, envy, covetousness, and imperiousness, they aren't just bad or flaws to be eliminated. Instead, he proposes they are life-conditioning emotions as factors which must be present, fundamentally and essentially, in the general economy of life.
Whoa. So they're not just tolerated, but necessary for life to develop, to assert itself, maybe even to overcome.
That's his controversial view. He imagines a philosophy that sails right over morality, one that might even need to crush out and destroy perhaps the remains of our own morality to get to a profounder world of insight.
Now that sounds dangerous. Is he just advocating for immorality?
Not exactly. It's more about seeing human drives as forces that come before moral judgments are applied to them. He even provocatively suggests that if only our world of desires and passions is what's truly given as real, then maybe the causality of the will is the only causality there is, operating everywhere as will to power and nothing else.
Meaning all actions, even ones that look selfless, might ultimately be expressions of this basic drive to grow, assert, dominate, overcome.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
So, for you, the listener, how does this idea of the will to power as this fundamental life impulse challenge those traditional ideas of good and evil?
And could embracing potentially negative emotions as necessary drives actually be a path to a deeper understanding of human nature, maybe even personal growth?
And this new lens, the will to power, it radically changes how Nietzsche looks at religious life, too.
He doesn't just dismiss it as false, right?
No, not in a simple way. He questions why the religious mood is so universal. He sees it as this really rich area for psychological and historical study rather than simply a divine phenomenon. He famously analyzes God on the cross, not just as a divine sacrifice, but as an act of boldness in inversion, a transvaluation of all ancient values.
And he connects this specifically to what he calls a slave insurrection in morals among the Jews.
Yes, where the powerful, the rich, the worldly, the Greco-Roman ideal maybe were deliberately recast as godless and wicked, and the poor, the meek, the suffering were elevated, becoming the saint, the friend. It was, in his view, a strategic redefinition of virtue that came from a position of historical disempowerment.
So this raises a really important question for us. How do major religions, like Christianity and Buddhism, fit into this framework?
Well, Nietzsche controversially argues they function as religions for sufferers. They try to preserve and keep alive whatever can be preserved, even, he claims, that which should have perished.
That's harsh. What does he mean, should have perished?
He thinks these religions, by actively reversing all estimates of value and shattering the strong in favor of the weak, the sick, the suffering, actually contribute to what he calls the deterioration of the European race. They value weakness over strength.
But he also sees a paradox, doesn't he? Like how powerful people sometimes honored saints.
Exactly. He observes that the mightiest men have hitherto always bowed reverently before the saint, but maybe not out of true piety for the saint's goodness. Instead, he suggests they divined in him the superior force which wished to test itself by such a subjugation, the strength of will in which they recognized their own strength and love of power and knew how to honor it.
So they admired the sheer willpower in the saint's self-control, even if it was directed towards asceticism. They saw a fellow expression of will to power.
That's the interpretation.
Yeah.
He wants to stress this isn't an argument against religion as a belief system per se, but an analysis of its function, its impact on human development and values, especially its role in turning established hierarchies upside down.
So for you, the listener, how does looking at religious doctrines as maybe psychological or historical phenomena, rather than just spiritual truths, change your perspective on their huge influence on our values and how societies develop?
Right. It forces us to think about the practical consequences of belief systems, regardless of their claims to divine origin.
That's a really uncomfortable, but yeah, undeniably thought-provoking analysis of religious influence. And building on this unsettling reevaluation, Nietzsche throws out this truly shocking thesis that challenges our core ideas about human achievement.
Which is?
Almost everything that we call higher culture is based upon the spiritualizing and intensifying of cruelty.
Wow. Okay, cruelty. That immediately challenges how we normally think about it, right?
Right.
We usually see cruelty as harming others.
Exactly. But Nietzsche suggests there's abundant enjoyment, even in one's own suffering, in causing one's own suffering, a kind of self-inflicted cruelty we often ignore.
How does he connect this to culture?
Well, he points to the painful delight of tragedy, that strange, almost pleasurable intensity we get from watching deep suffering on stage. He suggests the sweetness we find in the sublime, that feeling of awe mixed with a bit of terror, and even the highest and most delicate thrills of metaphysics, get their appeal solely from the intermingled ingredient of cruelty.
It's like the deeper we go, the more uncomfortable, maybe even painful the truth gets. And yet, we're drawn to it.
That seems to be the idea. He provocatively claims that in every desire for knowledge, there is a drop of cruelty.
Why cruelty in knowledge?
Because, in his view, the human spirit has this fundamental will towards appearance and superficiality. We prefer comfortable, easy answers. So, profound thinking, which forces us to take things profoundly, variously, and thoroughly, is actually a violation and intentional injuring of that natural preference for the easy way out.
Ah, so it's a cruelty of the intellectual conscience
Hmm.
to force yourself beyond comfy, superficial understanding, to face difficult truths that shatter your illusions.
Exactly. So, for you, the listener, if growth, if self-overcoming, if the very pursuit of higher culture inherently involves this kind of cruelty towards oneself and one's comfortable ideas, forcing a deeper, often uncomfortable clash with reality, what does that imply about personal and societal progress?
Does discomfort, maybe even suffering, become a necessary ingredient for real advancement? Something we actively, maybe unconsciously, even seek out in our striving for something more?
That's a heavy thought. So, given these radical reevaluations of truth, morality, even the self, what kind of person can actually navigate this kind of world?
Well, this is where Nietzsche introduces his concept of the free spirit. This is someone who lives within what he calls that strange simplification and falsification, meaning they see through the illusions of everyday life, but paradoxically, they have eyes for beholding this marvel.
They aren't afraid of the uncomfortable truths they find.
Exactly. He describes these individuals as belonging to a coming new order of philosophers, and he even dares to call them tempters.
Tempters? Why tempters?
Because they aren't just thinkers, they're catalysts for change. They will be very free spirits, he says, but also something more, higher, greater, and fundamentally different than any philosophers who came before.
And how will they be different? What defines them?
Well, they'll profoundly reject dogmatism in all its forms. They won't be preaching universal truths or demanding everyone agree. Instead, they might assert something like, "My opinion is my opinion. Another person has not easily a right to it."
They renounce the bad taste of wishing to agree with many people.
Precisely. Understanding that good is no longer good when one's neighbor takes it into his mouth. Meaning, when an idea becomes a mass-produced, watered-down ideal.
And they value solitude.
Deeply. He calls them the born, sworn, jealous friends of solitude, of our own profoundest midnight and midday solitude. Because real insight often needs detachment from the crowd.
But what's really key here is how Nietzsche sees these true philosophers. They aren't just philosophical workers or scientific men who collect facts or organize existing values.
No, he elevates them to commanders and lawgivers, people who don't just find values, but actively create values. They determine the whither and why of mankind.
So their knowing is actually creating. Their will to truth is really their deeper will to power.
That's the vision. The philosopher as an active shaper of human destiny. Not just a passive observer or interpreter of what is, but a creator of what should be.
It sounds like a call for a totally new kind of human being, doesn't it? A new ideal for what we could strive for, individually and collectively.
It's a powerful vision, absolutely. But this vision of the free spirit stands in really sharp contrast to what Nietzsche sees as the stupid old prejudice and misunderstanding of the free spirit as just being a leveler, or a scribe-fingered slave of the democratic taste.
Right. He critically examines what he calls the herd morality, that he thinks is just rampant in modern Europe, a morality that champions ideas like equality of rights and this overwhelming sympathy with all sufferers. It sees suffering itself as something inherently bad, something that needs to be done away with.
And he argues this gregarious morality, this herd instinct, comes mostly from fear of our neighbor. A fear of anything that stands out, anything that challenges the comfortable norm.
And this fear, he thinks, leads to branding strong, individualistic, maybe even dangerous instincts like love of enterprise, foolhardiness, rapacity, and love of power as automatically immoral.
Yes. Basically, any instinct that lifts the individual above the group, that risks disrupting the comfy peace of the herd, gets labeled evil. And this promotes a mediocrity of desires and stifles anything truly great.
He really laments what he sees as this universal degeneracy of mankind to the level of the man of the future. As idealized by the socialistic fools and shalopates, this degeneracy and dwarfing of man to an absolutely gregarious animal.
Yeah, he argues this relentless democratic movement creates a type of human being prepared for slavery in the most subtle sense. Not with chains, but through self-imposed mediocrity and just comfortable conformity.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit more. He contrasts this with his belief that humanity, the plant man, has actually grown most vigorously, precisely when under dangerousness of his situation and long oppression and compulsion.
Right. Those harsh conditions, he argues, forced our inventive faculty and dissembling power to develop into subtlety and daring. It ultimately increased our will to life into an unconditioned will to power.
So for you, the listener, do you see elements of this herd morality playing out in contemporary society? How might concepts like equality and universal sympathy, when looked at through this lens, paradoxically relate to a dwarfing of humanity or a suppression of certain powerful human instincts that, in Nietzsche's view, are actually needed for greatness? It's a really challenging thought, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And to dig deeper into this dynamic, Nietzsche introduces his famous distinction between two basic types of morality. They're rooted in their social origins and the different psychological states they emerge from: master morality and slave morality.
Okay, break those down. What's master morality?
Master morality, he explains, originates in a ruling caste, a class of people who are quite pleasantly aware of being different from and superior to those they rule. Their values come from an exalted, proud disposition. They emphasize faith in oneself, pride in oneself, and they show a radical enmity and irony towards selflessness.
So they define good as noble and bad as despicable. Contempt for the cowardly, the timid, the petty.
Exactly. For the master, good is strong, active, creative. They're proud of not being made for sympathy, seeing it as a weakness, and they have this deep reverence for tradition and their ancestors, who they see as models of strength.
Okay, so what about slave morality?
Slave morality, on the other hand, originates among the abused, the oppressed, the suffering, the unemancipated, those who are in a position of weakness and often resentment. This morality expresses a pessimistic suspicion towards the powerful. It's essentially the morality of utility.
Meaning it values qualities that help alleviate suffering and make life bearable for the weak, like sympathy, the kind, helping hand, the warm heart, patience, diligence, humility, and friendliness.
Precisely. And for this morality, evil gets defined as power and dangerousness. Anything that inspires fear, anything representing the strength and independence of the master.
So it's an inversion, redefining good as meekness and evil as strength.
Yes, that inversion is crucial. And this raises the important question: how did this profound switch happen? Nietzsche famously attributes it to the Jewish people. He claims they performed the miracle of the inversion of valuations, initiating the slave insurrection in morals.
How? By fusing rich, godless, and wicked into one condemning idea, and even using the word world itself as a term of reproach against the powerful.
That's his argument. Interestingly, he also notes that love as a passion, meaning intense romantic love, is of noble origin. He thinks it was invented by those Provençal poet cavaliers who were part of an aristocratic master morality culture.
Okay, so for you, the listener, which of these moral frameworks, master or slave, do you see most reflected in the world around you today? And how does understanding these potential historical and psychological origins change how you think about good and evil? It offers a dramatically different way to view our whole moral landscape, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a challenging framework for understanding how values get created and how they change over time.
Yeah. Now let's turn to some of Nietzsche's often, well, biting, and let's be honest, pretty controversial observations on European cultures. He presents these nations almost as distinct historical and psychological types, maybe even caricatures themselves. And it's really crucial here to remember these are his observations from the text, his interpretations through his unique philosophical lens. We're presenting them here for analysis and understanding, absolutely not as an endorsement or validation of any specific cultural or nationalistic critique. Our goal is just to explore his perspective as it appears.
Okay, understood. So where does he start?
First, Germany. Nietzsche, being German himself, is particularly harsh, actually. He suggests that what used to be called German depth is really a difficult, hesitating digestion, implying maybe a lack of intellectual agility or clear thinking.
And their famous honesty.
He claims it's often a dangerous and most successful disguise, even a proper Mephistophelian art, referencing the cunning demon from Goethe's Faust. He saw this kind of deliberate cloudiness, a deceptive simplicity hiding something else.
In German music, he critiques that too.
Oh, yeah. He sees Beethoven as just the last echo of a break in transition, not really a lasting European taste. And Wagner's Siegfried. Too free, too hard, too cheerful, too healthy, too anti-Catholic for old Europe. He basically implies that Germans lack a coherent today. They belong to the day before yesterday and the day after tomorrow, always looking back or forward, never fully present.
Okay, what about France?
He holds considerably more admiration for France. He considers it the seat of the most intellectual and refined culture. He thinks they possess a unique capacity for artistic emotion and a strong moralistic culture.
He praises their successful halfway synthesis of the North and South, like a blend of intellect and passion.
Exactly. He points to figures like Henri Bayle, better known as Stendhal, calling him the last great psychologist of France, someone who navigated the European soul with a Napoleonic tempo, with speed, insight, ambition. He saw France as embodying this vibrant, intellectually sharp culture.
And then there's England. What's his take there?
His view of England is quite stark, really. He largely sees England as the source of European ignobleness, the plebeianism of modern ideas, basically the spread of common mediocre thinking.
Ouch. And English Christianity.
He claims it carries a taint of spleen and alcoholic excess, suggesting a kind of gloomy, maybe even unhealthy spiritual life.
And their lack of music, for him, signals something deeper.
Yeah, a lack of rhythm or dance in the movements of his soul and body. He saw their wide influence, especially through people like Darwin and John Stuart Mill, as promoting this useful, utilitarian, but ultimately mediocre standard, which he believed squashed higher human potential.
And finally, the Jews. Beyond the slave insurrection.
Right. Beyond their crucial role in that inversion of values we talked about, he observes their enduring power and potential. He suggests that if they desired, could now have the ascendancy over Europe, implying their inherent strength and historical toughness.
Yet he also notes their desire for assimilation, to be insorbed and absorbed by Europe, to kind of put an end to the nomadic life.
Yes. And again, just to hammer home that crucial caveat, these are Nietzsche's observations from the text, presented solely so we can understand his unique historical and philosophical context. We are absolutely not endorsing or validating any of these potentially controversial views. We're just analyzing the raw material of his thought.
Understood. So for you, the listener, how do these broad cultural observations, even if they are controversial and maybe uncomfortable, provoke a deeper look at the historical forces Nietzsche believed were shaping national identities and values, and maybe how those values, in turn, influence philosophical thought?
Exactly. And as part of this wider cultural critique, this critique of what Nietzsche saw as the uglifying of Europe, this decline in taste, strength, intellectual sharpness, he presents some highly contentious remarks about women.
Okay, and it's absolutely essential here, as you said, to present these views impartially, strictly as they appear in the source material, without implying any agreement or disagreement. Our role is purely historical source analysis, understanding the text as it is.
Right. So what stands out in his view on women?
Well, he views woman wishing to be independent and therefore beginning to enlighten men about woman as she is as actually one of the worst developments of the general uglifying of Europe.
That's a strong statement. And he makes that provocative claim about truth.
Yes, that nothing is more foreign, more repugnant, or more hostile to woman than truth. Her great art is falsehood. Her chief concern is appearance and beauty.
And he sees the emancipation of woman not as progress, but as
a disintegration of womanly instincts, an almost masculine stupidity, and a defeminizing of women. He argues this defeminizing is often encouraged by learned asses of the masculine sex, who advise women to defeminize herself in this manner and to imitate all the stupidities from which man in Europe suffers, basically implying men are fools for encouraging women to adopt what he saw as men's own flaws.
So what does he think should inspire respect and fear in women?
He suggests it comes from her nature, which he describes in these really vivid terms. More natural than that of man, her genuine carnivora-like cunning flexibility, her tiger claws beneath the glove, her naivete and egoism, her untrainableness and innate wildness, the incomprehensibleness, extent, and deviation of her desires and virtues.
Okay, so for you, the listener, this historical perspective, however contentious and challenging it is for modern ears, it clearly reflects these deeply rooted and shifting societal views on gender and what's natural. How does examining these views, even if you completely disagree with them, maybe illuminate the historical and philosophical underpinnings of gender expectations that have shaped our past and still kind of echo in our present debates?
Right. It forces us to confront just how deeply ingrained and frankly how contested these ideas have been throughout history.
That's certainly a challenging perspective to engage with, but yeah, crucial for understanding this historical context. And continuing with this theme of appearances versus deeper realities, Nietzsche offers this really profound insight into the nature of deep thought and maybe even our own self-perception.
Which is
Everything that is profound loves the mask.
loves the mask, meaning.
He suggests that the profoundest things have a hatred even of figure and likeness. It's almost as if they resist being fully exposed or categorized or simplified. They kind of recoil from being pinned down and made superficial.
So the mask isn't necessarily deceitful.
Not always intentional deceit, no.
Yeah.
He explains that around every profound spirit there continually grows a mask, owing to the constantly false, that is to say, superficial interpretation of every word he utters, every step he takes.
Ah, so it's more that complexity gets inevitably simplified and misunderstood by others who can't grasp the full depth. The mask becomes a kind of self-protection against superficiality.
That seems to be the idea.
And he connects this idea of masks and appearances to morality itself.
He does. He claims that man has invented the good conscience in order finally to enjoy his soul as something simple.
Wow. So we create this internal sense of I'm okay just so we can feel comfortable with ourselves, reducing our complex inner world to something manageable.
That's the provocative thought. He goes further, stating that the whole of morality is a long, audacious falsification, by virtue of which generally enjoyment at the sight of the soul becomes possible.
A bold claim. Morality as this necessary collective artistic creation. A beautiful lie that lets us live with ourselves.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. This idea of concealment, it extends to philosophy itself. He asserts that every philosophy also conceals a philosophy. Every opinion is also a lurking place. Every word is also a mask.
Meaning, even in our most earnest search for knowledge and self-understanding, there are layers of concealment, layers of artifice, both intentional and unintentional.
Yeah, both for profound thinkers, maybe trying to protect their depth, and maybe just for us to function day to day.
So for you, the listener, if all profound thought needs a mask, if our own morality is maybe a kind of artful falsification, what does this tell us about authenticity, about human self-perception, about the very nature of truth itself?
Does it mean we can never fully know ourselves or others without somehow seeing through these necessary masks, without confronting those deeper, often hidden motivations?
That's a truly profound and maybe, unsettling question about authenticity. But to kind of conclude this really rich and often heavy exploration, Nietzsche offers a surprisingly lighter, yet still profoundly insightful observation. It circles back to the very nature of the philosopher and perhaps the truly free spirit.
Okay, what is it?
He playfully suggests, I would even allow myself to rank philosophers according to the quality of their laughing, up to those who are capable of golden laughter.
Golden laughter, that's not just about telling jokes, right?
No, definitely not. It seems to be about a certain kind of intellectual resilience, maybe a profound detachment, a joyful acceptance of the world's complexities, even its absurdities.
And he connects us to the gods.
Yeah, he notes that gods are fond of ridicule. It seems that they cannot refrain from laughter even in holy matters,
Oh.
implying that a certain divine, almost detached perspective can embrace irony, absurdity, even irreverence when facing life's messiness. It's a sign of strength, not weakness.
That sounds right. And he connects this to the gay saber, or gay science.
Yes, that term from the Provençal poet Cavaliers he admired refers to this joyful, lighthearted pursuit of knowledge. He suggests it serves as an amulet against the sickly irritability and sensitiveness towards pain that he sees in many groups, especially those who preach excessive sympathy or just dwell in suffering.
So it's a call for a robust, joyful, maybe even playful approach to knowledge and life, even when facing difficult, uncomfortable, or tragic truths.
It feels like the ultimate beyond good and evil stance, doesn't it? That ability to laugh, maybe even at oneself in the face of it all.
So for you, the listener, in a world often filled with earnestness, suffering, intense seriousness, what role does laughter, ridicule, or irony play in confronting uncomfortable truths or challenging established norms?
Can a capacity for golden laughter actually be a philosophical tool, a sign of intellectual health and freedom, a way to navigate the uncanny valley of these profound, sometimes disturbing ideas?
We've certainly covered a huge amount of challenging ground today, haven't we? Journeying through the seismic shifts that Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil kicked off. We started by questioning the very purity of that will to truth, exploring how our most cherished moral ideas might be historical caricatures or even falsifications necessary for life.
Right. Then we dug into the problematic nature of free will, seeing it maybe as this complex internal command and obedience structure, not simple autonomy.
Then we pivoted to the will to power as this fundamental impulse driving everything, reevaluating traditional religious feelings, and even suggesting that higher culture involves a kind of spiritualizing of cruelty.
And finally, we explored that radical vision of the free spirit standing against what Nietzsche called herd morality. And we looked at his often unsettling cultural takes, all while understanding the crucial role of masks and maybe golden laughter in deep thought and self-perception.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener, and for how we actually comprehend radical ideas?
Well, Nietzsche himself suggests something quite profound. The greatest events and thoughts, the greatest thoughts, however, are the greatest events, are longest in being comprehended. The generations which are contemporary with them do not experience such events. They live past them.
So, given the challenging, maybe uncomfortable ideas we've explored today, ideas that ask us to look beyond what we comfortably accept, how might the concepts we've discussed be lived past by us as a contemporary generation? Are we perhaps only truly experiencing them superficially, or will they only be fully understood much later by those who come after?
Right. What does that say about our own ability to truly grasp radical shifts in perspective, especially ones that demand we confront our deepest prejudices? What profound hidden truths might be waiting for us, for you, to truly experience them beyond our immediate understanding and maybe beyond our current comfortable prejudices?
Thank you for joining us on this in-depth exploration into the foundations of belief. This has been the Uncanny Valley podcast.